Hey guys, welcome to Scientific Drinking, episode 3. Today we're going to be talking about how to build a 21st century spaceport. Cheers. So Kennedy Space Center was founded in 1958, and this 3 years later, it was put as one of the prime facilities for the moon mission for the Apollo program. And since then, it's pretty much been a staple of NASA. And when you think of NASA, you pretty much think of Kennedy Space Center, you think of Johnson and some pretty iconic buildings, you think of the command center, and most especially the VAB, that big vehicle assembly building with the big NASA logo slapped on the side. So to the topic at hand, Kennedy Space Center. It was founded in 1958, and just 3 years later, it was put in charge of the moon landing, or at least one of the main sites for it. There's been a lot of programs and a lot of launches that come out of here, as I'm sure everyone's aware. Over time, it's acquired 570 square kilometers. That's huge. Now, most of that is the Wildlife Conservation Center, which I'll talk to you about later. So in 2011, which was the last year the space shuttle flown, STS-135, there was about 13,000 workers at the Space Center. When the wheels of that space shuttle hit the ground and that crew returned safely home, 6,000 workers were laid off like that. And that was a huge hit, not just to the Space Center, but to the entire area around here, the Space Coast region, because that's a lot of unemployment to happen in one center. A lot of the economy here depends on the Space Center and the visitors it brings in. So all of these people were suddenly without a job, and the Space Center was without a lot of funding because the Space Shuttle program brought in a lot of money. So it had to figure out how to adapt and change to the times. Bob Cabana, the center director, was recently awarded a prestigious Sammy, which is an award given to government workers, about how he transformed the Space Center, how he worked with community and to transform the center. And the key word about all of this is commercialization. Today, just about 8 years later, there are about 17,500 employees, more than there was at the Space Shuttle era. So that's a huge turnaround from the small amount that was there following the end of the Space Shuttle program. What we're going to do now is go onto the Space Center and take a look around. I'm going to point out some examples of commercialization. We're going to look ahead to the future to see what we've learned from the past and how to implement that to make a real spaceport, something where people will go to hop on a spacecraft and go to space. So let's head over to Kennedy Space Center, Launch Complex 39B, and the mobile launcher. We're out here at pad 39B at Kennedy Space Center. What you're looking at behind me is the mobile launcher on pad 39B. This mobile launcher is capable of launching not only NASA's SLS, but it's flexible enough to adapt to the needs of different rockets, such as the Omega rocket being built by Lockheed right now in the VAB, which we'll take a look at next. So we'll talk a lot more about the mobile launcher and the VAB in our next video about how to launch the biggest rocket in the world, mainly talking about SLS. But for now, what we're focusing on is the adaptability required to launch multiple different types of rockets from different manufacturers, which all have different setups and how they're fueled, different types of fuel, and different configurations. So looking over to the right of mobile launcher, we have two spheres over there. One is the white one, which is a LH2 tank, liquid hydrogen, and the gray one, which is going to be the new liquid hydrogen tank. The white one was used to fuel Apollo and Space Shuttle, and the gray one is going to be used to fuel SLS. Now, it's important to note that we need these large fuel storage systems not only to fuel the rocket, but because these fuels are cryogenic, meaning they have to be kept at very, very low temperatures or else they tend to evaporate. That's the steam you see coming off the rockets when they're on the pad. In order to keep this cold enough, we have to have a vacuum layer around the fuel so that we minimize this evaporation. The longer the rocket sits on the pad before launch, the more fuel is wasted. So looking forward in the 21st Century Space Center, we have to have enough fuel to continually resupply these rockets, which is an infrastructure challenge in itself. Not only gathering the fuel, but keeping it cold enough so that it lasts long enough to fuel the rockets. So now that we've talked about the mobile launcher and NASA's infrastructure, let's take a look at how we've taken existing Apollo infrastructure and turned it into a commercial asset. Here at SpaceX's pad 39A. This is a perfect example of taking Apollo age infrastructure and turning it into a commercial asset. SpaceX signed a 20-year lease agreement with NASA to use this facility for their Falcon, Falcon Heavy, and Starship programs. Now, right now, you can see it's equipped just for their Falcon and Commercial Crew program capabilities, which has the Dragon capsule mounted on top of a Falcon rocket. You can see the swing arm up there in white on top of that black tower. That's to load the crew onto the capsule. We want to make more of NASA's property accessible to commercial partners, and indeed lease government property for them to use. This helps reduce the cost burden on the taxpayer and helps develop this industry that's really important for NASA. But that doesn't mean everything's going to be leased out. NASA still has to have a presence here. The government still is going to have a role guiding the future of the space industry, just for safety and to help influence the economy. Let's take a look at Kennedy Space Center and Google Earth. First, we have the VAB and Central Campus building, neither of which are going anywhere. Then we have buildings owned or leased by commercial partners like Boeing, SpaceX, Space Florida, Blue Origin, and logistics facilities in the north and south of the campus. Add to that a scattering of old Apollo and Shuttle era buildings all over the place, some fuel depots along with the Ascent Abort facility, each with its own respective keep-out zone, the security perimeter, and finally, the 100-year floodplain. All of these things make for a challenging place to develop, but there are a few things we definitely can do. First of all, we can integrate logistics into one centralized location, reducing the need for duplicative storage. Some of those older buildings we can tear down, and instead we can build a centralized integrated campus that's walkable for employees and includes a lot of natural lighting. Finally, that security perimeter can be moved back, allowing for more commercial development closer to that central campus. Finally, we can add a rail system that increases accessibility for tourists, commercial partners, and employees alike. That's how you build a 21st century spaceport. So I know that was kind of a simplified illustration of what the plan is at the Space Center. And there's a lot of aspects and a lot of cogs and stuff to making that work, but at least that gives some interpretation of the complexities that you have to deal with. So that's really what the Space Center is trying to do. It's trying to diversify its portfolio. It has the funding source from the government, it has the funding source from these companies, and it has the funding source from tourism and travel and maybe even space tourism pretty soon. So let's go to the whiteboard and summarize really quick before I drive home my final point. We have to think about what we do now will impact the design and layout of future space centers. For example, different architecture decisions we're taking in the United States as opposed to Europe. Europe went very heavily in the form of walking cities and public transportation. The United States, everything was built around the car, and that precedence is something we're still feeling today. It's hard to get public transportation going in the United States because why would we hop on a train when it's so much easier to hop in your car? And that's really exacerbating our carbon footprint and making it a lot more expensive to just live and work in the United States because everything's so spread out. Another precedent of this is flight as well. The United States and Europe had different ideas about flight infrastructure. How do you monitor planes? How do you keep track of aircraft? How do you organize all the flights that are surely going to come in the future? In the 30s, Europe had quite a robust flight infrastructure. World War II, Europe was decimated and they had no way to maintain this infrastructure. The United States stepped up and said, hey, listen, I have this system and I want to put it in place. Because that system did not mandate the continual tracking of aircraft, we've had a lot of missing aircraft. Europe's infrastructure may have prevented things like that, but they just weren't able to do it. So that's the point I'm trying to make, is that the decisions we make today will be felt for tens or hundreds of years in the future. All right, guys, and the final thing I want to drive home for this video is conservation. Recently, 11,000 scientists really took up arms and announced that, this is really a climate emergency that we're having. Kennedy Space Center is working towards that conservation status, but it's hard, without the funding, without the commercial investment to go 100% green, it's not something that can really happen. But that being said, there are steps we can take. For example, a new solar plant is going in just north of the Visitor Center, which is in addition to the solar farm that already exists on Kennedy Space Center. Buildings can be built with better insulation to reduce the demand on air conditioning. A centralized walking campus means that there's less need to use your own personally owned vehicle to travel back and forth or rent a government vehicle, and it reduces the footprint on the wildlife preserve, allowing more room for nature to develop and a greener, more appealing and beautiful campus to work with. Next week we'll cover the SLS, and thanks for watching. Cheers!